Thank you for coming to our celebration of the 150th anniversary of the birth of Impressionism. Also, greetings to everyone watching online or in the future. Obviously, you all love Impressionism, otherwise you wouldn't be watching this. It was an art movement that brought color and spontaneity to the canvas. Everyone recognizes the names, and they have their favorite painters. I absolutely love Berthe Morisot's use of color and quick brush strokes, but like many people, Monet is my favorite. By way of introduction, I'm Leigh Cohn. I've loved and studied Impressionism my whole life and have been a serious oil painter since the 90s. The 1990s. This is a picture of me with a Monet that was owned by a rich relative who collected art. Being able to get so close to their paintings gave me a deep personal connection to Impressionism. On this date, in 1874, the 7 up-and-coming painters listed here banded together for what would later be called the First Impressionist Exhibition. And I'm going to tell you a story about how that happened. But first, here goes the quickest history of Western art you'll ever see. We begin with the Lascaux cave paintings from roughly 32,000 years ago. Jump ahead to the Greeks and Romans, who emphasized warriors and myths. The Gothic period favored biblical scenes. Biblical themes continued through to the Renaissance. And later the classical and neoclassical periods were revivals of past glories of the ancient Greek and Roman times, and they lead us up to the 19th century. In the mid-1800s, artists were moving towards the depiction of everyday people and settings more literally or in an exaggerated classical style. They were casting off the themes of the past, and in that way, this was a dramatic shift in the ultimate progression to Impressionism. In 1859, Napoleon III agreed to Baron Haussmann's plan to modernize Paris. The poor were pushed out to the suburbs, and their old neighborhoods were razed, including Renoir's family home. Medieval walls were torn down, plumbing issues were solved, and the rising middle class moved into a revitalized central city. In other words, it was gentrification. The 1860s were a period of social change, but the art world was stuck in its ways. For more than 200 years, the Paris Salon des Beaux-Arts, or simply the Salon, set the standard for what was acceptable and popular in art. It was held annually at the Palais de l'Institut, an enormous exhibition hall. It was a must-see event for the upper and middle classes, and it was the only legitimate way for painters to be seen. The Salon clung to the old themes, and their jury primarily chose paintings by long-established artists who were members of the Académie des Beaux-Arts, and thousands of people attended. This also created a monopoly on which artists' paintings would be purchased by the wealthy and the bourgeoisie. One notable Salon regular was Camille Corot, an academic painter from Paris. He also bridged the gap between classical landscapes, like this one showing the ruins of a Roman aqueduct, and the realism of his later years. Corot's muted color palette and use of earth tones was the standard per the taste of the Salon. He was greatly admired by the younger generations of artists, such as Monet and Manet, who are not to be confused. So, Claude Monet was born on the Normandy coast, and his early style was reminiscent of Corot and other academic painters. Monet came to Paris in 1858 at the age of 18, around the time that scores of other young artists were also flocking to the city. You can see Corot's influence in this subject matter, but by 1885, Monet's Impressionist techniques took hold, and we see obvious differences in their style. Now, Edouard Manet was 8 years older and already established before Monet arrived in Paris. He was born into a wealthy, politically influential Parisian family after the French Revolution of 1830. Manet refused to follow his father into law, and he failed the Naval Academy entrance exams, probably on purpose. Instead, he desperately wanted to be a successful salon painter. Manet was a flaneur. He lived off family money and had intellectual and artistic friends. Charismatic and impetuous, he befriended the younger painters and was pivotal in the transformation from realism to impressionism, but he never considered himself part of their group. As I said, Monet was younger and came to Paris to study painting in 1858. Like Manet, he was charismatic and could be charming, but Monet was more sensitive and sensible. Manet was wealthy and could afford nice clothes. Monet was not wealthy, but he still liked nice clothes. There's a 1914 short film of Monet painting water lilies in a pristine white three-piece suit. But that was just for the cameras, and he normally dressed more like a peasant when painting or gardening. He sold caricatures while he was in his mid-teens, and they were signed to Oscar, and whether that was his first name or middle name, it's never been entirely clear. Once he started painting, he signed as Claude Monet. However, he was always just Monet, even among friends and family. At a Paris frame shop, his caricatures were displayed side by side in the window, with paintings by Eugène Boudin, who was 16 years his senior. Monet disliked Boudin's style and avoided him, but one day they met at the store, and both being from the coastal port of Le Havre, they struck up a conversation. Boudin said Monet's drawings were not serious art, and he encouraged him to paint. Reluctantly, Monet agreed to accompany Boudin on a plein air outing, and it was the first time he had ever painted in nature. And this is what the 18-year-old produced. Besides Boudin, Monet also studied with other respected teachers. At one studio, he became friends with other students around his age. His closest friend was Pierre-Auguste Renoir, who was born in Limoges and moved to Paris as a baby. Even as a toddler, he showed natural talent drawing pictures on the floor in chalk. From a young age, he was expected to work and apprenticed as a painter of china. Although he painted landscapes, people were his forte. However, the salon judges were critical and insulting. Renoir was ready to give it all up and return to porcelain, but Monet kept encouraging him. At one point, while they were poor and struggling roommates, Monet would dress in his finest clothes and charm tradespeople into having their portraits painted by Renoir for about 50 francs, which helped them get by now and then. This portrait is of William Sisley. He was the father of their friend Alfred Sisley, who was born in Paris to a wealthy British family that lost everything during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Because of that loss, Alfred decided to become a full-time painter. He had works accepted at the salon, however he joined his friends in breaking away from the establishment. I'm not sure why Sisley isn't as famous as the other two, nor are his works worth as much today. Some of his paintings fetch in the low millions, but one recently sold for $200,000, which is a steal for an original impressionist. But unfortunately, Sisley only was able to sustain a meager income from his paintings. The fourth member of this circle of friends was Frédéric Bazille. His family owned vineyards and were wealthy wine merchants. When he was 18, Bazille moved to Paris to study medicine, but he was drawn into taking painting seriously after hanging out with Monet, Renoir, and Sisley. This is his studio, which was far larger and more posh than anyone else's. Bazille was generous with his friends, often loaning them money that they would never repay and paying for food and wine at the cafes where they gathered. It's always easy to tell which one is Bazille because he's always the tall, thin one. Manet is standing there holding a paintbrush, and I'll show you what Manet could do with someone else's painting in a little while. Their friendships remind me of the ones I first made in college. We were all around the same age, from different backgrounds, and coalesced around common interests, many of which were anti-establishment, like embracing new kinds of music and fashion or opposing the draft. For the Impressionists, painting held them together, but they also had similar social and political views. Besides their mutual studies in the studio, they were all primarily plein air painters. They painted with the same portable materials and often the same scenery. Monet and Renoir were particularly close, and when Renoir was broke and talked about returning to painting images on porcelain, Monet strongly encouraged him. As roommates, they pooled their meager resources, subsisting on large sacks of beans or lentils, which would last for a month. Meanwhile, a couple of other painters were striking up a friendship. Camille Pissarro was the oldest of the Impressionists, and he took the younger Paul Cézanne under his wing. Pissarro was born in the Dutch West Indies, but was sent to a boarding school near Paris when he was 12, returning to St. Thomas a few years later to go into the family business. But he dreamt of becoming an artist, and he spent virtually all of his spare time drawing. After being mentored by a local artist in St. Thomas, Pissarro returned to Paris to become a full-time painter, and he gained acceptance to the Salon. Pissarro fell in love with Julie Villay. Julie was his mother's maid, and the family was aghast. Initially, they tried to keep their relationship secret. Incidentally, most of the Impressionists were in long-term relationships, but marriage wasn't a high priority and usually came for pragmatic reasons after children were born. The normal response from their families was usually disapproval, at least early on. Pissarro and Julie already had 2 children when they got married in London during the Franco-Prussian War, because he could protect her and the kids with his Dutch citizenship. They were devoted to each other for life and had 7 surviving children, 6 of whom would become painters. And that's not surprising because he was a great teacher. Mary Cassatt said that Pissarro could have taught the stones to draw correctly. Incidentally, my rich relative who had the Monet also owned this Pissarro, and I spent timeless moments staring at it, and I now see that it had a profound effect on my own painting style. So Pissarro is my teacher too. When the war ended in 1871, the Pissarro family returned to their village in a suburb of Paris. Their house had been ransacked, and the German occupiers had ripped the canvases from their frames, using them as doormats in the mud and butcher's aprons. Close to 1,500 of his paintings were destroyed, as well as some Monets he had. It was nearly 15 years of his work lost forever. He befriended many of the younger artists, and he was generous with his guidance. He and Monet were also close friends, although several years later, when Monet had greater commercial success, Pissarro claimed to his oldest son about an exhibit they were both in, writing that all the buyers only wanted Monets. Pissarro, Monet, and the others studied in the same studio, and in 1861, a strange, brooding new student arrived. Born into a prosperous French family, Cézanne was intense, clumsy, and suspicious that everyone was out to get him. True, his style was somewhat crude and got mocked. He applied and got rejected by the most prestigious schools. He had bouts of depression and a generally unapproachable personality. Paul was clearly not easy to warm up to. He had dark moods and felt discouraged with self-loathing. But Pissarro saw something in him, and very slowly a friendship ensued. Their relationship was central to Cézanne's growth, who said that Pissarro was a father for me. Pissarro guided Cézanne, telling him to only use the 3 primary colors and their derivatives, blue, yellow, and red. You can see here that there are a minimum of earth tones, and those are mixed colors as opposed to being straight from the tube. Pissarro encouraged Cézanne to forget about accurate drawing and to play with composition in new ways. Incidentally, Cézanne grew up with Émile Zola, who had also moved to Paris and become a renowned writer and friend to the painting group. They used to take off by train to the countryside, and that inspired the other painters to follow suit. About 20 years after this picture was painted, Cézanne and Zola had a falling out. The vindictive ex-friend then wrote a vengeful novel about a failed painter who kills himself, and it included a salacious description of his model, a character based on Cézanne's wife Hortense. Cézanne, still positively alive, settled in Bellevue, which is about 100 miles southwest of Paris, where he painted Mont Saint-Victor at least 80 times, as well as other scenes. He took on the role of mentor to later painters like Pissarro had been for him. Cézanne is best known for his influence on the Post-Impressionists and beyond, including Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse, who called Cézanne the father to us all, meaning Cubism and abstract art. Cézanne was also cherished by his contemporaries. Monet said of him that Cézanne is the greatest of us all. So back to 1863. It was a lovely spring day. Béziers, Renoir, and Monet are walking through the Luxembourg Gardens, whining about the academic studio where they studied. They admired the flowers in bloom and ordinary people wandering through the grounds, and Béziers said, "The big classic compositions are finished. An ordinary view of daily life would be so much more interesting." And the others agreed, and it planted a seed of an idea, but it would take a few years to sprout. In 1865, Monet brought Béziers to the Normandy coast for the summer, where they painted seascapes. Their canvases were nearly 5 feet wide, large and dramatic, intended for the salon. They were good friends, and Béziers a bit shy, and Monet bright, genial, and incredibly talented. Frédéric was devoted to Monet, who asked for and received his financial assistance during these years. Béziers wrote home that Monet, who was from Le Havre, was quite good at landscapes and was giving him very helpful advice. Back in Paris, Béziers was sick of the enormous paintings they'd been working on in the studio. Monet's Luncheon on the Grass was 20 feet long and 15 feet high, though this version is smaller. I'll tell you why. Monet had a habit of skipping out on the rent, and one time when he was evicted, he left the original, larger canvas as collateral. When he returned for it, the rolled-up canvas was in a shed, and mold had destroyed some of the areas of it. Monet cut it into sections and salvaged 3 of them, 2 of which now hang in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. For a while, Béziers was sick of Monet, who had been too demanding, using him as a model for 4 of the figures. One of the women who posed here repeatedly was Monet's favorite model and lover, Camille Dancieux. Here she is in a section that was salvaged from the original huge painting. He also pictured her in The Woman with the Green Dress, which he painted for and got accepted to the 1867 Salon. That same year, Camille gave birth to their son Jean. When Monet's father disapproved, he pretended to abandon his mistress and child. He also lied on Jean's birth certificate, stating that he was the, quote, legitimate son of Claude Oscar Monet, although they weren't yet married. He wrote to a friend, "She's given birth to a big and beautiful boy, and I don't know how, but I feel that I love him, and it pains me to think of his mother with nothing to eat. Now she and I are totally without money." They married in 1870 so that Camille could inherit a 1,200 franc dowry from her father's trust, which was in her name and thus protected from Monet's creditors. She was the great love of his life, and he painted Camille at least 30 times. Sadly, she died at the age of 32, a couple of years after the birth of their second child. But that's a story for another day. As far as love life goes, Alfred Sisley met similar resistance when he fell in love with an older woman with a dubious history. When he moved in with her, his still wealthy family disapproved and canceled his allowance. Alfred and Eugenie went to marry and have 2 children. Now, as I mentioned, Sisley didn't have great commercial success, and years later, during the end of the century, his wife died. A few months later, a heartbroken Sisley summoned Monet to his own deathbed, receiving assurances from Monet that he would provide for his adult children. Later that day, Sisley passed away. Getting back to the 1860s, the friendships grew and the painters picked up tips from one another. One day, while Renoir was painting a landscape in Fontainebleau Forest, he was being hassled by a group of rowdy teens. A man with a wooden leg emerged and chased them away with his cane. Then he noticed Renoir's painting and gave it a critique. Turns out the old guy was the Barbizon painter Degas. He suggested that Renoir use less black, like his academic teacher told him to emphasize, and the old man pointed out the dark green contrasts of the leaves and the trees above them, and the assorted colors in the nearby shadows, and told him, "Lighten up your palette." And Renoir brought this advice back to the group, though again, it took a few years to really sink in. Getting accepted to the Salon was still of paramount importance to all of these younger painters, and most of them were successful. Manet was driven to be critically accepted, but it was impulsivity and roguishness that led to his fame, or I might say infamy, all because of two outrageous paintings. In 1863, Emperor Napoleon III created the Salon des Refusés, or the Rejected, because there were complaints that too many painters were being rejected by the Salon. Manet stole the show with Luncheon in the Grass, which is 8.5 feet wide. This is what inspired Monet's 20-foot wide Luncheon painting. Manet's, which came earlier, combines realism and the classical. Let's see the nymph in the background. Nudity was not taboo, but placing his life-sized contemporary woman with two dressed men at a picnic was cruelly inappropriate and unacceptable. The painting became a political social spectacle. Art critics were incensed, and when the emperor saw it, he proclaimed that it was an offense against modesty. The Empress Eugenia turned away and she refused to look at it. His second scandalous painting was Olympia, which was accepted to the Salon 2 years later. Like the previous one, it also features a nude Victorine Morin, who was a well-recognized model who sat for many top painters of the time. Manet is believed to have been one of her lovers for whom she modeled. She also became a respected academic painter and spent the last 2 decades of her long life living with another woman. The problem with Olympia is that she's clearly a prostitute, and that's apparent by her suggestive pose, her bland expression, and other hints. On top of all that is that Manet is satirizing a well-known 16th century nude of Venus by Titian. As a schoolboy, Edward was described by teachers as frivolous, and with these paintings he might have been less interested in shocking everyone and making social statements than simply being recklessly foolish. He may have enjoyed the notoriety he received, but he didn't anticipate or want the critical anger and ridicule he received. No one really wanted to be buying Manet's. That same year, Monet had a more conventional painting at the Salon, and he received glowing reviews, much to Manet's chagrin. People were confusing them, and Manet certainly didn't want people thinking that he had painted the younger man's pictures. Nonetheless, Manet invited Monet to meet him at one of the cafes he frequented, and Monet brought along the whole gang. The younger men gravitated to Manet. He was a celebrity, he took risks, was anti-establishment, and could be incredibly entertaining as the center of attention at cafes and in studios. Manet was often joined by Edgar Degas at the cafes where he held court because he enjoyed their arguments and witty repartee. Born in Paris, Degas came from moderate wealth and was accepted to every salon from 1865 until the Franco-Prussian War started in 1870. Degas was also instrumental as an organizer of the Impressionist exhibitions, but his personality was off-putting. He could be sarcastic, combative, inappropriate, and obnoxious, but he was a brilliant artist. His subjects tended toward ballet, portraits, unflattering nude pastels, and sculpture. He was a loner, but he did collaborate with Mary Cassatt and other painters, though he usually alienated them. I was once virtually alone in the High Museum's galleries in Atlanta during a small preview party for a Degas exhibit, and I spent the whole evening going from painting to painting, carefully studying each one, looking at the sculptures, and all I can say is that he kind of makes me feel uncomfortable, and I think that's probably how a lot of his peers felt about him too. On the other hand, everyone loved Berthe Morisot. She came from an affluent bourgeois family. Her mother was friendly with Manet's family. Both Berthe and her sister Edma received a formal education in art, When Berthe was 20, she met Corot and under his direction took up plein air, but she focused much of her attention on women and children. She was the first female impressionist. When Edma left to get married, Berthe felt very alone, but she was definitely noticed. At a party hosted by Madame Manet, Edouard's friend, the portrait painter Fatin Latour, remarked that he had never seen such a ravishing beauty, and Manet replied, "Then you should have proposed to her." Getting back to Manet for a minute. When he was 18, Manet began an affair with his piano teacher, Suzanne Leonhoff. She might also have been his father's mistress. Edouard and Suzanne were secretly married after she had a son, though the paternity is uncertain. The boy was called her younger brother and his godson, but he may have been the boy's father or his brother. However, there was another woman who fascinated Manet. He painted Berthe Morisot a dozen times, always fully dressed, but often in sultry, seductive poses. Still single into her 30s, she carried an artistic mystique that baffled contemporaries in her artistic social milieu, and that made her the subject of fascination and gossip. For single women like herself, it would not have been acceptable to go to cafes or to be unescorted on painting expeditions to the country. However, given their mutual family connections, it was perfectly acceptable for Manet to paint her portrait and for them to look at and discuss each other's work. One time, Berthe was finishing a painting of Edma and asked for Manet's opinion. He said it was all good except for a lower portion of the dress. He picked up a brush and quickly fixed it, but he got so enthusiastic that he started repainting the entire canvas, joking as he went. She should have kicked him out and never spoken to him again, really. She was a far more skillful painter than he was anyway. But she was infatuated with him, attracted to his charisma and fame, and she overlooked his offensiveness. There have always been rumors that Morisot and Manet were lovers, and to keep their secret they burned all of their letters before she got married. But a recently discovered set of letters to her sister confirms the affair. Here's a picture of Berthe Morisot's husband during their honeymoon. He's Eugène Manet, Edouard's brother, with whom she had been friendly for years. Eugène worshipped her. Their marriage allowed her to stay in his brother's orbit. We haven't been following a strict chronology here, but we do need to briefly look at the Franco-Prussian War, which began in July 1870 and lasted for 6 months. Renoir was a pacifist, but he got drafted in the cavalry, and even though he had never ridden a horse and hated guns, his captain asked Renoir what was his profession. And instead of joining the war effort, Renoir ended up teaching the captain's daughter how to paint. However, most of the painters scattered. Monet and Camille fled to Normandy and eventually crossed the Channel to England. Cézanne and Hortense hid out in a small coastal village. I told you what happened with Pissarro. Manet remained in Paris, fortifying the city and bracing for invasion. He and Degas joined the artillery as volunteers and went on maneuvers together for hours, ankle-deep in mud. In addition to Pissarro's loss of paintings, an even greater loss to the group was the death of Frederick Béziers. He could have avoided the war. His rich family, the wine merchants, could have sent him away, but Béziers keenly enlisted. According to Renoir, Béziers had romantic visions of gallantry, riding a beautiful horse across a battlefield, but killed stupidly in retreat on a muddy road. After the war came the Paris Commune and the Civil War, and when that was subdued, the new government was vigilant. Tens of thousands of suspected French revolutionaries were rounded up and executed. When Renoir returned to Paris, he was arrested and barely escaped with his life when he recognized a journalist who was now an officer in uniform. One day, years earlier, while Renoir painted in a forest, the man staggered out of the bushes in rags. He was being hunted down by the authorities, and Renoir gave him a smock and brushes, saying to pretend that he was a painter. Karma seems to have played a role in Renoir's rescue, because Renoir called out to the man who had him released. Nevertheless, eventually there was an armistice. One beneficial outcome came during the war. When Monet and Pissarro were in London, they were introduced to a man who would become the most responsible person for the eventual success of Impressionism. Paul Durand-Ruel was a well-established art dealer with galleries in Paris and London, and he offered to handle their paintings. He became their key supporter, collecting and selling their paintings, and in turn others in the group. He often paid in advance when they had no other sources of income. His contributions are vast, and he introduced Impressionism, not only in his galleries, but also in America. Over the next couple of years, Durand-Ruel's enthusiasm brought sales and recognition for many in the group. During a one-week buying spree, he spent 50,000 francs on 25 Manet paintings. Monet was selling enough paintings to rent a cottage in Argenteuil, an upwardly mobile middle-class village on the Seine, north of Paris. These were prosperous times, and then they weren't. The art market swung up and down, and the group persisted. Monet's friends visited frequently. During one excursion, Manet chose to paint Camille and Jean Monet in the garden, and Renoir set up his easel to paint the same scene. That was fairly normal amongst friends, but Manet was offended, who later told Monet, "He's no talent, this lad. You're a friend of his. Tell him to quit painting." So, we reach this date 150 years ago. As you can see, Manet is conspicuously missing. Manet was a salon painter through and through, until his death 9 years later at the age of 51. Of course, Frederic Béziers was also not included. He had died. However, he was the one who first came up with the idea of putting on their own exhibition, even though he didn't live to see it happen. In 1873, Monet brought Béziers' idea up to the core group, and with the help of a journalist, they decided to form an anonymous society to stage an exhibition. The whole concept was revolutionary. No salon, no juries, no old guard. Creating an anonymous society was seen as an overtly political act, and there were many naysayers. Frankly, the painters really just wanted to find a more democratic way to sell their paintings. Monet drafted the charter, and Pissarro traveled to Argenteuil to edit it. While Monet drafted the charter, he also painted Camille and Jean in these poppy fields near their home. You can feel his sense of optimism. Once the charter members signed on, Monet had trouble getting other artists to subscribe, and he took off for the Normandy coast. However, Degas was more persuasive. His recruitments led to more than 30 members, including more established painters, such as Corot and Courbet, who were probably recruited by Pissarro since he had studied with both of them. Degas also convinced the group that Morisot should be included as a charter member. She thought about the invitation, and Manet tried to dissuade her. He wasn't going to join this anonymous society, and neither should she. But like the others, she just wanted another way to sell some paintings, so she joined in. Monet was friends with everyone, and he happened to know Nadar, a celebrity in Paris, well known as a caricaturist and a photographer. Nadar was vacating his former studio, and when Monet told him about their goals for an exhibition, Nadar graciously offered the use of his old gallery, which stood empty on a prestigious boulevard less than a mile from the Louvre. The most famous painting from the exhibition was Monet's Impression Sunrise. Not because it was necessarily the best painting, although maybe it was, but because of a derisive art critic. Louis Leroy used the name of Monet's painting in his article titled The Exhibition of the Impressionists. In it, he dismissed the painting as being nothing more than a sketch or impression, not a finished painting. And that was the birth of Impressionism. Leroy was not the only negative critic. Mostly, the exhibition was panned. The show was a debacle. Sales were poor. Ironically, the least successful painter of the group was the most successful at the exhibit. Alfred Sisley brought in 1,000 francs, but none of the others made more than 200 francs. Degas and Morisot sold nothing. Even worse, Durand-Ruel's sales plummeted from the bad publicity, and he was forced to hold all payments on the painter's accounts. You'd think that this would be the end of the story of Impressionism, but this is only the end of the story of its birth.